"Say that again, Your Honor," slowly. The words didn't come from the veteran, they came from the silence that followed the judge's voice, a silence so complete it seemed to press against the walls of courtroom 3B like a physical weight, but Judge Marcus Hale didn't notice it, or chose not to, leaning forward over the polished oak bench with the kind of authority that had never been questioned in his entire career, his robe falling perfectly into place as he fixed his gaze on the old man before him. "I said coward," he repeated. Louder this time, each syllable sharp, deliberate, meant to cut, meant to land, and meant to be heard by everyone seated in the gallery, the clerks, the attorneys, the bailiff standing stiff near the door, all of them suddenly still as the word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, directed at Ethan Cole, 79 years old, seated in a worn wheelchair that creaked faintly every time he shifted his weight, though right now he didn't move at all, his hands resting loosely on the armrests. Veins visible beneath thin, weathered skin, his clothes simple, faded denim jacket, plain shirt, nothing that suggested anything remarkable, nothing that explained why the air in the room had just changed in a way no one could quite name. Judge Hale exhaled through his nose, impatience creeping into his expression as he tapped a pen against the bench, the sound echoing louder than it should have. "This court does not tolerate evasion," he continued, voice carrying the polished edge of someone used to being obeyed. "You were asked a direct question about your service record, Mr. Cole, and instead you sit there in silence, refusing to answer, refusing to clarify, and expecting this court to treat you with respect?" A faint murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly stifled, as if even that small reaction felt inappropriate in the presence of something none of them understood yet. Ethan's eyes remained forward, pale blue, steady, not defiant, not submissive, simply present, as if he were looking through the judge rather than at him, and that, more than anything, seemed to irritate Hale further. "Men who served honorably don't hesitate," the judge pressed, leaning in slightly, his voice lowering but gaining intensity. "They don't hide behind silence, they don't dodge accountability, and they certainly don't sit in my courtroom acting like they're above answering a simple question." The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, casting a flat glow across the room, reflecting off the polished surfaces, the brass nameplate, the glass of water untouched at the corner of the bench, every detail sharp, every sound amplified in the stillness, and still Ethan said nothing, only the faint tightening of his fingers against the armrest betraying that he had heard every word, that he understood exactly what was being said, and chose not to respond, not yet. Somewhere to the side, behind a desk cluttered with files and neatly stacked documents, Emily Carter, the court clerk, paused mid-typing, her fingers hovering just above the keyboard, her eyes drawn not to the judge, but to the old man. Something about the way he sat, the way he held himself, quiet but unshaken, triggering a subtle unease she couldn't explain, like recognizing a pattern without knowing where she had seen it before. Judge Hale straightened, clearly dissatisfied, his voice rising again to fill the room. "If you have something to say, Mr. Cole, now would be the time," he declared, each word measured, controlled, but edged with something sharper underneath, something closer to irritation than authority. And still, the veteran remained silent, the air tightening further, the courtroom holding its breath without realizing it, as if the next sound, whatever it would be, was going to matter far more than anything that had been said so far. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the courtroom like a shadow that no one could step out of, and Judge Hale felt it even if he refused to acknowledge it, his jaw tightening slightly as he leaned back in his chair, adjusting the sleeve of his robe with a controlled motion that carried more irritation than composure. "Let the record show," he began, his voice sharper now, louder, as if volume alone could reclaim control, "that the defendant continues to refuse cooperation with this court." The clerk's keyboard finally clicked again, but slower this time, each keystroke measured, uncertain, Emily Carter's eyes flicking up again toward Ethan Cole, drawn not by what he was doing, but by what he was not doing, because men who were intimidated shifted, they fidgeted, they spoke too quickly or not at all in a way that felt defensive, but this was different, this was stillness that felt chosen, deliberate, like a man waiting for something inevitable to arrive. The faint hum of the air conditioning filled the gaps between words, and even that seemed too loud against the quiet that followed. Judge Hale exhaled, tapping his pen once more before setting it down with a soft but deliberate click. "You expect sympathy," he continued, his tone now carrying a trace of disdain that was no longer hidden. you expect this court to believe that your silence means something. That it carries weight, that it deserves respect. He leaned forward again, eyes narrowing slightly, because from where I am sitting, Mr. Cole, it looks a lot like avoidance, and avoidance, in any uniform or out of it, has a very simple name. He paused just long enough to let the word form again in the air without speaking it, letting everyone remember it on their own, letting it settle. Ethan's gaze shifted, not upward toward the judge, but slightly to the side, toward the far wall where a small American flag stood in its holder, its fabric unmoving in the conditioned air, his eyes resting there for a moment that stretched just a fraction longer than natural, and in that moment something subtle passed across his face, not emotion, not reaction, but recognition, as if the room had faded and something older had taken its place. Emily noticed it, the slight change, the almost imperceptible shift, and her fingers stopped again above the keyboard, her instincts telling her that whatever was happening now did not belong to the routine of court proceedings. Judge Hale followed the movement of Ethan's eyes and scoffed quietly, misreading it entirely. Now you remember the flag, he said, the edge in his voice returning. Now you find something to look at instead of answering. A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats, the subtle creak of wood and fabric breaking the stillness for a brief second before settling again. The bailiff glanced toward the judge, then back at Ethan, uncertainty flickering across his face. Because even he, who had seen years of defendants pass through this room, could not place what he was seeing, could not match it to anything familiar. Judge Hale straightened once more, clearly preparing to push further, to force a response. I will ask you one final time, he said, each word deliberate, controlled. State your unit, your rank, and your service history for the record. The demand hung there, formal, absolute, leaving no space for anything but compliance, and still Ethan Cole did not answer, not immediately. His hand shifted slightly on the armrest, fingers brushing against something near his chest, a small metal tag hanging just beneath the collar of his shirt, worn smooth by time, its surface dull under the fluorescent light, unremarkable at a glance. But the movement caught Emily's attention instantly, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she leaned forward, trying to see it more clearly, trying to understand why something so small suddenly felt like the center of everything unfolding in that room. And for the first time since the judge had spoken, Ethan inhaled slowly, quietly, as if preparing not to defend himself, but to finally end something that had already gone too far. The faint metallic edge of the tag caught the overhead light as Ethan's fingers brushed against it, not gripping, not presenting, just acknowledging its presence like something that had never needed to be shown to anyone before, and yet the movement alone shifted the balance in the room in a way no one could explain. Emily leaned forward a fraction more, her chair creaking softly beneath her as her eyes locked onto the small object. It was not polished, not decorative, not anything that resembled the medals or insignia she had seen in official ceremonies. It looked worn, almost intentionally unremarkable, as if it had spent decades hidden rather than displayed. Judge Hale noticed the movement as well, his gaze dropping briefly before returning to Ethan's face, misreading it as hesitation, as weakness, as something he could press harder against. Finally, he said, a thin smile forming at the corner of his mouth, something worth looking at. He gestured with a slight flick of his hand. Go ahead, if that little piece of metal helps you remember who you are supposed to be, by all means. A few quiet chuckles attempted to surface in the gallery but died almost immediately, smothered by the same tension that had been building since the first word was spoken. Ethan did not react to the remark, his thumb tracing the edge of the tag once, slow, deliberate, and in that small motion something changed behind his eyes. Not emotion, not anger, but distance, as if the room, the judge, the voices had all receded behind something older. Something far quieter and far heavier. The fluorescent light seemed to dim without actually changing, the hum of the ventilation softened into something that felt almost like static, and for a brief moment the courtroom no longer felt like a place of law, it felt like a place waiting for an answer it did not understand. Judge Hale leaned forward again, impatience now fully visible. Mr. Cole, he said, voice tightening, this is not a stage for theatrics. You have been asked a direct question, and I will not repeat myself again. His hand came down lightly against the bench, not a strike, not forceful, but enough to punctuate the demand. Your unit, your rank, your service history, each word spaced, controlled, final. The bailiff shifted his weight near the door, the leather of his belt creaking softly, his eyes flicking between the judge and the old man, uncertain which one he should be watching more closely now. Emily's screen glowed faintly in front of her, the cursor blinking in a blank space where a response should have been recorded, but her hands remained still, suspended, waiting, because something in her told her that whatever was about to be said would not fit into the standard lines of a court transcript. Ethan's breathing remained slow, steady, almost inaudible, his gaze lowered now, not in submission, but in focus, as if the words forming in his mind required precision, required care, required a weight that could not be rushed. The tag rested against his fingers, its edges worn smooth by time, by years that had never needed explanation, and then, without lifting his head, without raising his voice, without changing his posture, he spoke, the sound so quiet it barely seemed to leave his lips, yet it cut through the room with a clarity that no one could ignore, a single phrase, measured, controlled, and unmistakable, something that did not sound like a rank, did not sound like a unit, did not sound like anything the courtroom was prepared to process. And for a fraction of a second after it was spoken, nothing happened, no reaction, no movement, just a silence that deepened into something absolute, as if the entire room had missed the meaning but felt the weight of it anyway, and somewhere behind the stillness, Emily's eyes widened, because she had heard it clearly, and she knew, without knowing how she knew, that it was not meant for the courtroom at all, it was meant for someone else entirely. For a fraction of a second, the courtroom did not understand what it had just heard, the words were too quiet, too controlled, almost lost beneath the low hum of the lights, but they did not fade, they lingered, settling into the air with a weight that no one could immediately explain. Judge Hale blinked once, his expression tightening as he leaned forward slightly. "I am sorry, what was that?" he asked, not out of courtesy, but irritation, the kind that comes when something disrupts a carefully controlled environment. Ethan did not repeat himself, he did not look up, his hand resting once more against the worn tag at his chest, as if the single phrase had already done everything it needed to do. The silence stretched again, thicker now, heavier, and this time it carried something different, not just tension, but recognition trying to surface without permission. Emily's breath caught almost imperceptibly as the words replayed in her mind, not because she understood them fully, but because of the way they had been spoken, the cadence, the precision, the absence of hesitation. It was not a guess, it was not a defense, it was something that had been used before, somewhere else, in a context far removed from a courtroom. Her eyes dropped quickly to her screen, fingers moving now with sudden urgency, not typing a transcript, but opening a secured database she was technically not authorized to access without cause. Her pulse quickened as she entered fragments, not the full phrase, just enough to test a pattern. The system hesitated for a moment longer than usual before responding, a delay that made her stomach tighten. Judge Hale exhaled sharply, clearly losing patience. "Mr. Cole," he said, voice rising again, "this court does not operate on whispers and riddles. If you have something to say, you will say it clearly for the record." He glanced briefly toward the clerk, expecting confirmation, expecting movement, but Emily did not respond. Her attention locked onto the screen in front of her as a single line of text appeared where there should have been nothing, not a record, not a file, but a restriction, a classification notice that did not belong in a civilian system. Her fingers froze, hovering above the keyboard as the meaning settled in slowly, heavily, like a realization she did not want to accept. Across the room, the bailiff shifted again, this time more noticeably, his posture no longer just attentive, but alert, as if something instinctive had been triggered without a clear source. The gallery remained still, but the quality of their stillness had changed. People were no longer just watching, they were waiting. Judge Hale straightened, his composure thinning at the edges. "I will not ask again," he said, each word sharper than the last. "State your service information or this court will proceed accordingly." The words echoed slightly off the walls, but they did not land the way they had before. Something in the room had shifted beyond his control, something he could not see, could not measure, and therefore could not command. Ethan finally lifted his gaze, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to meet the space in front of him. His eyes calm, steady, unchanged, as if nothing about this moment required urgency, required defense, required explanation, and that, more than anything, unsettled the room, because it suggested that whatever had just been set in motion was no longer dependent on what happened inside this courtroom, but on something far beyond it, something already moving, already responding. and somewhere behind the bench, unseen by most, a faint vibration began, subtle, almost indistinguishable at first, the soft buzz of a device receiving a signal that had not been expected, not here, not now, and Emily's eyes lifted slowly from her screen, her expression no longer uncertain, but stunned, because she understood now that the words spoken moments ago had not been an answer, they had been a call. The vibration grew just enough to be noticed, not loud, not disruptive, but out of place in a room that had been defined by stillness. Judge Hale paused mid-breath, his eyes shifting instinctively toward the source behind the bench where a secured court device rested, its screen dark but pulsing faintly with an incoming signal that did not follow the usual protocol. He frowned, irritation flickering into something closer to confusion, because nothing in his experience prepared him for interruptions that did not announce themselves clearly. What is that? He muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else, but no one answered, because no one knew. Emily's screen updated again, not with information, but with absence, entire fields locked, replaced by a single line that read access restricted beyond clearance. Her throat tightened as she realized that whatever system had responded to the phrase spoken moments ago was not simply protected, it was isolated, segmented from everything she had ever worked with. She glanced toward Ethan, her expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to disbelief. Because he had not moved, had not reacted to the vibration, had not even acknowledged that anything had changed, as if he had expected it, as if this was the natural consequence of something long established. Across the room the bailiff took a small step forward without realizing he had done so, his posture no longer neutral, his attention fixed entirely on the old man now. The gallery remained silent, but the silence was no longer passive, it carried weight, anticipation, the sense that something unseen was unfolding just beyond their understanding. Judge Hale straightened, attempting to reclaim the room, his voice rising again though it lacked the sharp certainty it had held before. "We will maintain order," he said firmly, though the words felt less like a command and more like a reassurance he needed himself. "Mr. Cole, you will answer this court." But even as he spoke, the device behind him vibrated again, longer this time, insistent, the sound cutting through his words in a way that could not be ignored. His jaw tightened as he turned slightly, reaching back to glance at the screen, expecting a routine notification, a scheduling conflict, something mundane, but what he saw made him stop, not dramatically, not visibly to most, but enough that his next breath came slower. The display did not show a name, did not show a number, it showed a designation, a channel he had only ever heard referenced in passing, never used, never expected to appear in his courtroom. His fingers hovered above the device for a moment before pulling back, as if touching it required a decision he was not prepared to make in front of everyone. Emily noticed the hesitation, the subtle break in authority, and her pulse quickened, because in that small moment the structure of the room shifted. The judge was no longer the center of control, something else had entered, something that did not ask permission. Ethan finally lifted his eyes fully, not toward the device, not toward the judge, but forward, steady, composed, as if acknowledging a timing that only he understood. The tag at his chest rested still now, no longer being touched, no longer needing to be, and in that stillness there was a quiet finality, like a door that had already been opened and could not be closed again. The device vibrated once more, sharper this time, and Judge Hale, despite himself, reached for it, his hand slower than it should have been, his confidence no longer absolute, and as his fingers made contact with the screen, the room seemed to lean in without moving, every eye fixed, every breath held, waiting not for what the veteran would say next, but for what the world outside that courtroom was about to say back. The moment the judge's finger made contact with the screen, the device stopped vibrating, not gradually, but instantly, as if whatever was on the other end had been waiting for that exact acknowledgement. The silence that followed was sharper now, edged with something unfamiliar, something that did not belong to courtroom procedure. Judge Hale's eyes scanned the display, expecting a message, a notification, something he could interpret and control, but what he saw was not formatted like anything he had encountered before. No case number, no sender identification, just a secure channel indicator and a single line of text that appeared one word at a time, deliberate, controlled, almost as if it were being typed live from somewhere far beyond the walls of that building. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the confidence in his shoulders tightening rather than settling, because for the first time since the proceedings began, he was not certain of the rules governing the moment. "This line is restricted," he read quietly, not intending for the room to hear, but the silence carried his voice farther than expected. A faint murmur stirred in the gallery before fading again. Emily leaned slightly to the side, trying to catch a glimpse of the screen, but she could not see the words clearly. She did not need to. She recognized the structure, the tone, the absence of explanation. It matched what she had seen on her own terminal, and that realization settled heavily in her chest. Judge Hale swallowed once, his hand still hovering near the device, uncertain whether to continue or disconnect, but before he could decide, the text shifted again, a second line appearing beneath the first, this time not informational, but directive. "Confirm verbal input." The words were simple, but they carried weight, authority without introduction, command without context. His brow furrowed, irritation trying to resurface, trying to reassert itself against the unfamiliar. "This is a court of law," he said, louder now, turning slightly as if to remind the room, to remind himself. "We do not respond to unidentified communications," but even as he spoke, his voice lacked the edge it had carried before, because the device remained active, unyielding, unaffected by his declaration. Ethan sat unmoved, his gaze steady, not watching the device, not watching the judge, simply present, as if the exchange unfolding behind the bench was no longer his responsibility, as if he had already done what was required of him. The bailiff shifted again, his stance widening slightly, not out of aggression, but readiness, his instincts responding to a situation he could not define but could no longer ignore. Emily's fingers hovered over her keyboard, her screen still locked behind layers she could not bypass, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them fitting the reality in front of her, because this was no longer a matter of records or procedures, this was something operating on a level she had never been trained to handle. Judge Hale looked back down at the device, the screen waiting, unchanged, the prompt still present, and for the first time, hesitation was visible, not in his words, but in the pause before them. "Verbal input," he repeated under his breath, the phrase unfamiliar in this context, his eyes flicking briefly toward Ethan, searching for something, guidance, reaction, anything that would help him interpret what was happening. But Ethan offered nothing, no acknowledgement, no instruction, just that same quiet, unshaken presence, and in that absence, the decision fell back to the judge, alone, exposed in a way he had never experienced before. The room seemed to narrow around that moment, every sound fading, every movement stilled, until there was nothing left but the waiting prompt on the screen and the expectation that hung in the air. And slowly, almost reluctantly, Judge Hale leaned closer, his voice lowering, not out of authority this time, but caution, as he spoke into the device, repeating the exact words he had heard only moments ago, testing them, offering them back to whatever was listening on the other side. And the instant the final syllable left his lips, the screen changed. The change was immediate, not dramatic, not loud, but absolute. The screen did not flicker or transition, it simply replaced what had been there with something new, something that carried a weight far heavier than text should. A designation appeared first, bold, unmistakable, not a name but a classification, one that did not belong in a civilian courtroom. One that did not belong anywhere outside of places that did not exist on maps. Judge Hale's breath slowed, not by choice, but because something in his body recognized that what he was looking at was not meant for him, not meant for this setting. The second line followed, precise, controlled, confirming what had just been spoken, not as a response, but as an authentication. The words on the screen did not question, did not verify in the way normal systems did, they acknowledged, they recognized. And in that recognition there was a shift in authority so subtle yet so complete that it left no room for interpretation. Behind him, the faint sound of another device activating echoed softly, not the same vibration as before, but a different tone, sharper, more official, and then another, somewhere near the side of the room, a quiet series of signals that did not belong to the courtroom's normal operations. The bailiff turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to locate the source, his instincts now fully engaged, no longer uncertain but alert. Because whatever had just been triggered was not contained, it was spreading. Emily's screen changed again, this time not locking her out, but displaying a message she had never seen before, a directive that overrode everything else. Her hands trembled slightly as she read it, not because she did not understand the words, but because she understood exactly what they implied. Her gaze lifted slowly toward Ethan, the pieces aligning in a way that made her chest tighten. Because the phrase he had spoken was not just a call, it was an identity, and not one that could be written into a public record. Judge Hale's grip on the device tightened just enough to be noticeable, his authority now challenged by something he could not argue with, could not overrule, could not dismiss. He glanced toward the courtroom doors without realizing he had done so. A subtle shift, but enough for those paying attention to notice. The gallery remained silent, but the silence was no longer passive, it was charged, every person in the room feeling the shift even if they could not explain it. Ethan remained exactly as he had been, still, composed, his gaze steady, as if none of this was surprising, as if this outcome had been inevitable from the moment he chose to speak. The tag at his chest rested against the fabric of his shirt, unmoving, unremarkable, yet now it seemed to carry more weight than anything else in the room. The lights above flickered slightly, not failing, just adjusting, the hum shifting in pitch for a brief second before settling again, and then, from the hallway beyond the closed doors, came the sound that changed everything, not loud, not aggressive, but unmistakable, the synchronized rhythm of footsteps, measured, controlled, approaching with purpose, the kind of movement that did not hesitate, did not question, did not belong to uncertainty. The bailiff straightened instinctively, his posture snapping into something closer to attention without conscious thought. Judge Hale's eyes fixed on the doors now, no longer pretending control, no longer anchored to the bench, because whatever was coming was not responding to him, it was responding to something else entirely, and as the handle turned slowly, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, not out of fear, but out of the sudden understanding that the moment they had just witnessed was not the peak, it was only the signal that something far greater had just arrived. The door did not burst open, it moved with controlled precision, the handle turning fully before the hinges released with a soft, deliberate motion, and the first thing that entered the room was not a voice, not a command, but presence, the kind that carried weight without announcing itself. Two uniformed officers stepped inside first, their movements synchronized, their posture exact, not aggressive, not hurried, but unmistakably purposeful, the kind of discipline that did not need explanation. The courtroom did not react out loud, but something in the air shifted instantly, the gallery straightened, conversations that had not even begun were already silenced, and even the subtle sounds of movement seemed to withdraw. Judge Hale remained standing behind the bench, his hand still resting near the device, but his attention had fully shifted now, fixed on the figures entering his courtroom without request, without acknowledgement of his authority, and that alone was enough to fracture the control he had maintained all morning. Behind the two officers, a third figure appeared, slower, measured, older, but carrying something far heavier than rank alone. His uniform was not decorated in excess, it did not need to be, the insignia on his shoulder spoke quietly, but with absolute clarity, a man who did not arrive anywhere by accident. The bailiff stepped aside instinctively, not because he had been told to, but because something in him recognized the necessity of it, his posture tightening into something closer to respect than procedure. The man walked forward without looking left or right, his focus not on the judge, not on the room, but on a single point ahead, Ethan Cole, still seated, still unmoved, as if this arrival was not an interruption, but a continuation. Judge Hale cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "This is a restricted proceeding," he began, his voice firm but lacking the sharp edge it once held. "You cannot enter without." He stopped, not because he chose to, but because the man had stopped walking, and in that pause there was something final, something that did not invite interruption. The officer closest to the bench stepped forward slightly, his voice calm, even, but carrying authority that did not need to raise itself. "This proceeding is now under review," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that every person in the room heard it, and more importantly, understood that it was not a request. Judge Hale's mouth opened slightly, a response forming that never fully arrived, because the structure of the room had already shifted. The bench, the gavel, the authority he had relied on, all of it felt smaller now, contained within something larger that had just entered without permission. Emily's breath caught as she watched the exchange, her eyes moving between the man who had entered and Ethan, the connection between them not spoken, not acknowledged, but undeniable, because the moment the man reached the center of the room, he stopped, turned, and faced Ethan directly, and for the first time since he had entered, his posture changed, not dramatically, not exaggerated, but enough to signal recognition, enough to signal respect. the kind that could not be performed, only given. And in that quiet shift, the entire courtroom understood what had just happened, not through explanation, not through words, but through the absence of them, because no one spoke, no one moved, and even Judge Hale, standing at the highest point in the room, remained silent, watching as the authority he had exercised just moments before was replaced by something far older, far quieter, and far more absolute. And Ethan Cole, the man who had said almost nothing, finally lifted his gaze to meet the man standing before him. Not as a defendant, not as someone on trial, but as someone who had just been recognized exactly for who he was. No one gave an order, no one announced what came next, and yet the shift happened with a precision that felt practiced, inevitable. The senior officer standing before Ethan held his gaze for a brief moment, long enough for recognition to pass between them without a single word, then slowly, deliberately, he straightened and brought his hand up in a salute, not rushed, not ceremonial, but exact. The kind of movement that carried decades of meaning in a single gesture, and for a heartbeat the room did not understand what it was seeing, because salutes did not belong here, not in a courtroom, not directed at a man who had just been questioned. And yet it was unmistakable, the insignia on the officer's uniform catching the light as his hand held steady, the silence deepening into something almost reverent. The two officers behind him followed without hesitation, their movements synchronized, their posture locking into place, and then, as if a signal had passed through the room without being spoken, the bailiff straightened fully, his hand rising almost instinctively, not out of protocol, but respect. The gallery remained seated, but every head was lifted now, every eye fixed on the quiet center of the room where the impossible had just become undeniable. Judge Hale stood frozen behind the bench, his hand still resting near the device, but forgotten now, his authority reduced to something distant, something procedural. He had spent years commanding silence, demanding order, controlling outcomes, but this silence was not his, this order did not come from him, and there was nothing he could say that would reclaim it. Emily's eyes blurred slightly as she watched, not from confusion, but from the overwhelming clarity of what was unfolding. The system on her screen no longer mattered, the locked files, the restricted access, all of it had been replaced by something far simpler and far more powerful, recognition. Ethan remained seated, his posture unchanged, his hands resting where they had been. He did not return the salute immediately, not out of disregard, but because nothing about this moment required haste. His eyes moved across the room slowly, taking in the shift, the silence, the weight of what had just been revealed without being explained, and then, with the same quiet control he had carried from the beginning, he raised his hand, returning the gesture, not as a performance, not as a display, but as something complete, something that had never needed an audience. The motion was small, almost understated, but it settled the room in a way nothing else could have, because it confirmed what everyone had already begun to understand. That the man they had seen as a defendant, as a question, as an uncertainty, had never been any of those things. The senior officer lowered his hand, his expression steady, respectful, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, carrying none of the volume that had filled the room earlier. This proceeding is concluded, he said, not as a request, not as a suggestion, but as a fact that no one challenged. Judge Hale did not respond, he could not, because there was nothing left for him to assert, nothing left for him to correct. The structure he had relied on had already shifted beyond his reach. The gavel remained untouched on the bench, unnecessary now, as the silence held for one final moment, not empty, not uncertain, but full, complete, and understood. And as the officers stepped back, creating space not around authority, but around respect, the courtroom did not erupt, did not react, it remained still, because some moments were not meant to be broken by sound, only remembered. And in that stillness, one truth settled quietly over everyone present: respect is never forced. It is revealed, and once it is seen, it cannot be taken back.